The main goal of my short presentation will be to discuss the relevance of empathy in the appreciation of art, which is a very old issue. I hope to have time in the last part of my talk to show that actually the notion of empathy, Einfühlung, was generated in the debate taking place in the second half of the 19th century. And the polemics between a formalistic account of art and an idealistic account of art. To the best of my knowledge, the first time the word Einfühlung was used was by Robert Vischer, the son of Theodor Vischer, in 1874. So there is an original link between empathy, the aesthetic appreciation of art, and what's new is that we are starting to learn the mechanisms that are underpinning this capacity that we have, a very basic one, to understand what's going on in our social world. But I think that some of these mechanisms may be relevant also when we look at inanimate objects. A still life is much less still than we would expect if we spell it out in terms of the activation of brain mechanism. Almost 15 years ago, we discovered a very strange class of neurons sitting in the premotor cortex of the monkey brain. This neuron not only fire when the monkey grasped object, manipulated object, but had the remarkable property of responding also when some other individual, be it another human being or another monkey, in front of the monkey we were recording from, was performing the same action. So this neuron responds when the monkey is grasping something, but also when the monkey is observing someone else doing a similar action, with a variable degree of congruence between the visual and motor properties. So there is a part of the brain which reacts in a very similar way when someone is doing something or watching someone else doing the same thing. We very briefly explore the functional properties of this neuron in a series of experiments which enable us to understand that not only this neuron fire when the action is observed or executed, but also when we have limited visual access to the action we are witnessing. So say we know there is an object, the object is hidden from our vision, a hand disappears behind that occluding screen, we imagine that the hand is doing something with the object, and this leads to the activation of this neuron. And similarly, if an action is coupled with a peculiar sound, like breaking a peanut, produces a sound which is very different from the sound produced by tearing a sheet of paper apart, even the pure sound of the action is enough to drive the activation of this neuron. So we think we are entitled to claim that they sort of embody an abstract level of action representation. And what's more interesting for our discussion today is that the same mechanism appear to be present even in more sophisticated way in our brains. These are very sketchily different regions in the brain, the ventral premotor cortex, encompassing the posterior part of Broca's region in the left hemisphere, the posterior parietal cortex, and a visual area, the superior temporal sulcus region. All these areas have been shown to be activated in this double fashion when we act or when we see someone else acting. And not only hand actions, but also foot actions or mouth action lead to the activation of, in a very coarse somatotopic fashion, an activation of the same motor region which are normally active when we perform. So when we are watching Super Bowl, we do not only activate the visual part of our brain, but even the motor part of our brain come into play. So we don't perceive just with the visual system, but we perceive also with the motor system. And this is quite interesting. And even when we perceive a static image of a hand which in a goal-related fashion is doing things with an object like this hand grasping a bottle, they still produce a strong activation of the same system. This is a paper by Scott Johnson, Frey, Scott Grafton, and So even a static image of a hand doing things with an object, that's why I was saying at the beginning that a still life, it's really a moving life, at least in the brain of the perceiver. What about when perceiving performing arts like dance? This is a very nice experiment done by Calvo Merino, Patrick Haggard, and Richard Passigam, Julie Grèze, and Glaser. Participants were a professional dancer, classic ballet or capoeira dancer. I didn't know about capoeira. I learned from my wife that is a Brazilian dance. And so if you're a classic ballet dancer and you watch classic ballet steps, your motor system resonates a lot more with respect to the situation in which you see a dance you're not professionally skilled, and the other way around, which means that the system can be trained by your experience. So the more you get acquainted with something, the more your brain resonates along with what you are looking at. Right. So the author of this study concluded that the mirror system integrates observed actions of others with an individual's personal motor repertoire and suggests that the human brain understands action by motor simulation. The notion of simulation, I'll come back to it later on. But what is even more interesting is that not only when we perform an action or we observe an action or we listen to the noise produced by an action, all these conditions lead to the activation of the mirror system. These and other studies show that even when we listen to a sentence which describes that particular action, that also leads to the activation of different segregated regions of our own motor system. So even language induces a motor simulation process which benefits of the activation of mirror neurons in our brain. So we started from the domain of action, but of course we thought that this mechanism could apply also to other domains. And inspired by the work of many of our colleagues, I would mention first the great contribution of Antonio Damasio in bringing emotion back again into the ballpark of consciousness and cognition. We decided to study emotion, and we wanted not our participants to simply simulate an emotion, but they wanted them to subjectively experience a peculiar emotion. And to that purpose, we convinced them to enter the scanner, wear a mask, and inhale disgusting odorants, because we wanted to induce the subjective feeling of disgust, and we contrasted the activation of their brain induced by the feeling of this peculiar emotion with that induced by the observation of actors pretending to be either pleased, disgusted, or showing a neutral face. And the result, very briefly, of this experiment show that there is an overlapping region within the anterior insula that was one of the main targets of Ray Dolan's talk, which is active both when I am disgusted, but also when I see the facial expression of disgust in the face of someone else. So this is one component, I believe, of the mechanism that enable us to feel how does it feel to be disgusted, which is a sort of visceromotor, somatosensory related mechanism of embodied simulation. Then there is another component, which is the component of resonating with our own facial mimicry. This is a study showing that if someone is monitoring the activation of your own facial muscles, when you're watching the expression of happiness, anger, disgust displayed by the facial mimicry of someone else, your muscles become active, and the degree of activation of your own facial muscle nicely and directly correlate with your degree of being empathic. So there is a positive correlation with the score you get in a questionnaire aiming to determine if you are or not an empathic person, and the degree of activation of your own facial muscles. So there are, in many domains, simultaneously, our body resonates along with the body of other individuals. This is a mirror neuron, I would say, for pain, sitting in the anterior cingulate cortex, a part of the brain that was also described by Ray Dolan in his talk. So this neuron fire when this patient, which is fully conscious, is locally anesthetized, receives a painful stimulus on his finger, but also when he watches the neurosurgeon applying the same painful stimulus to the finger. So this neuron fire when I feel pain, but also when I see someone else feeling pain. And in the experiment by Tanya Singer and co-workers that Ray presented, we learned that even a cognitive mediation, so an arrow appears on the screen, I know my partner is undergoing a painful stimulus, even in that case we have an embodied simulation of part of the brain circuitry which underpin that peculiar emotional state. What about touch? We touch in a very prudent way the legs of our participants when they were lying in the scanner in order to monitor which part of their brain, which we expected to know, the primary somatosensory cortex and the second somatosensory cortex were activated. Then we show them a video showing the leg of someone else being touched or simply approached by a stimulus. And only in the condition when they saw the leg of someone else being touched, that led to the activation of the second somatosensory area, which means that we don't see with our eyes, but we see also, in a sense, with our tactile apparatus. And to our big surprise, what was meant to be a control stimulus, even when subjects saw an object being touched by another object, that also led to the activation of this somatosensory related part of our brain. So the strong hypothesis here is that by means of this embodied simulation mechanism, we may not only be able to make sense of the tactile experiences of other individuals, but also perhaps partly to entertain an abstract notion of touch. And this is fully consistent with what has been anticipated in the domain of philosophy by phenomenologists. Notably, Edmund Husserl claimed in the second book of the Ideas, in every experience of spatial objects, the lived body of the experiencing subject is co-present as a perceptual organ. And I think this is exactly what we are measuring with brain imaging nowadays. These results were replicated and extended recently by the group in Queen Square, by Sarah Jane Blakemore and co-workers. Chris Freed was one of the authors. And they not only show that your tactile system becomes activated when you see the body of someone else being touched, but also that if you are a synesthetic person, so someone who not only knows how does it feel to be caressed or slapped on your face, but literally is feeling in her or his body the sensation experienced by the person he's seeing, the same network becomes active to a higher degree of activation. Which seems to suggest that if the system, the embodied simulation process, the mirroring mechanism works up to a certain level, we are able to empathize. If it works below a certain level, we become autistic to understand how does it feel to be in that particular state. But if it's activated beyond a certain threshold, we become synesthetic. It's a very, very crude hypothesis, but I think that part of this data may suggest further experiment to test it more in a more systematic way. Now let me turn to the last part of my talk. As I said, many of these ideas were around since many years. A famous great artist, great musician, Giuseppe Verdi, when he was preparing himself to compose one of his masterworks, Un ballo in maschera, wrote in a letter, "Torniamo al passato e ne seguirà un progresso," which means let's look back to the past. He was meaning to the musical past, and a progress will ensue. And so, even much earlier on than the second half of the 19th century, in La Scienza Nuova, Giovan Battista Vico writes, in tutte le lingue, la maggior parte delle espressioni, I'm an Italian academy, so I'm entitled to speak Italian for a while. In tutte le lingue, la maggior parte delle espressioni di intorno a cose inanimate sono fatte con trasporti del corpo umano e delle sue parti, e degli umani sensi e delle umane passioni. which roughly means in all languages of the world, the vast majority of the expressions relating to inanimate objects are made by means of transpositions of the human body, of its part, of the human senses, and of the human passions. And I think that what we are starting to rediscover with a different level of description, which is that brought by neuroscience, is exactly that. And so Theodor Vischer the father, in 1866, criticizing his own magnus opus, a 6 books treatise on aesthetic, a typical systematic work of a German scholar. After 10 years, he realized it was almost completely wrong about what he wrote. And he wrote, in its very first step, aesthetics must destroy the illusion that beauty can exist without the active contribution of the perceiving subject. Beauty is quite simply not an object. Beauty is the contact between an object and apprehending subject, and since what is truly active in this contact is the subject, it can be termed an act. And the son, Robert Vischer, who introduced Einfühlung, writes, I transpose myself into the inner being of the object and explore its formal character from within, as it were. This kind of transposition can take a motor or sensitive form, even when it is concerned with lifeless and motionless forms. And we can continue with Heinrich Wölfflin. How is it possible that architectural forms are able to express an emotion or a mood? And in his Prolegomena zu einer Psychologie der Architektur in 1886, he writes, physical forms possess a character only because we ourselves possess a body. If we were purely visual beings, we would always be denied an aesthetic judgment of the physical world. But as human beings with a body that teaches us the nature of gravity, contraction, strength, this is well before George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, you see. Contraction, strength, and so on, we gather the experience that enable us to identify with the conditions of other forms. And we can continue with Merleau-Ponty. Things have an internal equivalent in me. They arouse in me a carnal formula of their presence. So one interesting aspect that I would like to tackle experimentally is the difference in our brain when we entertain a prosaic vision of a landscape, for example, with respect when we entertain the artistic vision of the same object. And that's even more interesting with contemporary art. So what makes the apple of Cézanne more quintessentially apple-ish than a picture portraying an apple? What makes of this wheel a piece of art and not of this? Or this is even more evident in this case with the Duchamp fountain. It gave me a hard time to find the equivalent and managed to find it in the web display of manufacturers selling this kind of tools. We can continue with the bottles or with the Campbell soup and whatever. So I came up with a model to bring together all this empirical data. I think that these mirroring mechanisms in our brain are important in creating what I call a shared manifold of intersubjectivity. So an intersubjective, we-centered space that we normally automatically and unconsciously use to make sense, which bootstrap furthermore sophisticated cognitive account of our social world. And I take it to be an essential ingredient for the capacity of our brain-body system to model its executive and perceptual interaction with the world. So it is through this modeling process, embodied simulation, that we are capable to entertain an intentional attunement with the world of others, and as we have seen, also with the world of objects. So the human brain is endowed with structures that are active both during the first and third person perspective of actions, emotion, and sensation. And the subpersonal architecture of embodied simulation exemplified by mirror neurons that we originally discovered within the domain of action could well be a basic organizational feature of our brain. At least this is our working hypothesis. So by means of embodied simulation, an intentional attunement is generated, and this is something which I take to be related to our capacity to experience ecstatic, bringing back the word to its original meaning, which is that of aistasis, which is a very interesting combination of the polysemy of language. It combines sense with meaning in the same word. So I would like to conclude with a quote of Merleau-Ponty from this short, marvelous book, which is The Eye and the Soul. We speak of inspiration, and the word should be taken literally. There really is inspiration and expiration of being, action and passion so slightly discernible that it becomes impossible to distinguish between what sees and what is seen, what paints and what is painted. It can be said that a human is born when something that was only virtually visible inside the mother's body becomes at one and at the same time visible for itself and for us. The painter's, we could generalize, the artist's vision is a continued birth. Thank you very much.